Welcome to Green Building Matters, the podcast that matters for green building professionals. Learn insight in green buildings as we interview today's experts in LEED and WELL. We'll learn from their career paths, war stories, and all things green, because green building matters. And now our host, and yes, he has every LEED and WELL credential. Here's Charlie Cicchetti.
Be sure to check out the Green Building Matters community, where you can have unlimited exam prep for any of the professional credential exams you're tackling next, as well as putting your continuing education on autopilot, saving time with GBS reporting your hours on your behalf. Check it out, gbes.com/join. Now, enjoy this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. I'm your host, Charlie Cicchetti. This week, we've got Jeff Oberdorfer. He's coming to us from Santa Cruz, California, as a LEED fellow and just an authority on affordable housing, green buildings, and so much more. Jeff, how you doing today?
I'm doing good.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. Fascinating background, and just really want to first ask, where'd you grow up and where'd you go to school?
I grew up on Long Island, about a 45-minute train ride out of New York City. So I grew up thinking the whole world was like New York City in terms of transportation.
Sure. Good trains. And usually, we're recording this in the middle of the pandemic. I'm usually in New York about once a month, even though I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia. I love to go in, fly into LaGuardia, get over to Manhattan. So I love New York.
I took a course in high school in architecture.
No kidding.
And we had 3 years, 2 of mechanical drawing, and the third year was architecture. And I was floundering around till I took that course, and that was it.
Unbelievable. I hadn't heard a lot of high schools doing that. Would you say it was just a teacher that...
Actually, the guy who taught it was an auto shop teacher.
Nice.
He was into mechanical drawing. And we did 2 years of just engineering drawings, and then third year was architecture, and that just got me.
Oh, John. Okay, buildings. And then, so that helped you choose where you wanted to go to college and Kent State? I mean, what was that next choice for you?
Well, Kent State I was the oldest of 4 kids, and my father said, we got 4 kids going to college, so you got to go to a state school. And Kent State was a really good architecture school, and I wanted to get away from New York and wound up in Ohio.
Amazing. 2 questions about that time. As I've previewed your background, you were at Kent State during the time of the shootings, I believe. So, I mean, what was going on at that time? And then also in the architecture program you studied, was sustainability or energy efficiency part of the curriculum? So if you could take us back there for a minute.
Well, Kent State was an extremely conservative school, and it was also a suitcase school. So even though there's like 25,000 students, maybe 2,000 were on campus.
Oh, okay.
So the first thing that was interesting about being in that area of Ohio is my first year of architecture school, the Cuyahoga River would catch fire by spontaneous combustion. And that was the beginning of people's awareness of things were really screwed up. And nobody called it sustainability at the time. That wasn't a word people used. People didn't use green or sustainable. We did have an instructor who taught lighting, and he wrote the textbook on lighting and was very interested in the psychological impacts of lighting on people. And he also taught the energy section. Okay. So we had a really good background in energy and also in lighting. And that's what got me started in being interested in how the environment impacted people. And I joined a group called EDRA, the Environmental Design Research Association, which was a lot of academic architects who were interested in how the environment impacted people and in surveying that. That's where post-occupancy evaluations started. So I became very interested in that. And in architecture school, after the shootings on May 4th, 1970, I left to go to New York City to work for an architect, which I had scheduled before the killings. When we came back the last year, This was before killings had happened in high schools and around the country. There was no psychological help. There was nothing like that. We just came back cold turkey. And the first project we got in senior architecture school was bringing people in Kent together again. But we didn't have the skills to do that.
Resources, yeah.
So that got me really interested in community participation and how we look at community. And the big issue, of course, at the killings at Kent State is it happened at the architecture school. So there's bullet holes in the bathrooms and the old architecture school. And the open space, Taylor Hall, which is the architecture school, sat on top of a hill. And the open space below it was the commons where students at any time could gather about anything. It was like common space. And the National Guard basically took that away. And that's what started the conflict. So that got me interested in the rights of people in open space, in urban or college open space. And that kind of started me off. So I left Kent and I went to live in Boston, Cambridge.
Okay.
And I wound up teaching at Tufts University on issues that we're talking about. And I had students at Harvard and MIT taking my courses because nothing was taught like that at either of those schools. So quickly I got a reputation for being known for looking at how do people participate in the environment? What is community? This was not discussed in the 70s. So this was all new. Everything I did was kind of an experiment, kind of stumbling forward, taking as many different jobs as I could find, learning about interiors, about landscape, about urban design.
You really were out there before anyone else had done it. And I usually ask what aha moments, but you just told me several, and some of those very heavy. So that was a big influence on you. And then I guess, at what point though in the career did you know like sustainability, and no matter what I'm going to do in this career, it's got to have and like you said, the word sustainability might have been around at the time.
I became really interested when I moved to California in 1980 about non-toxic building materials.
Okay.
So I was interested in linoleum, cork, bamboo, and I started getting clients by word of mouth who had neurological problems, chemical allergies, coming to consult with me. And many of them were living outside on their deck because the indoor air quality was so bad. So my early career was based on what we call passive solar design and non-toxic building materials. The word sustainability, the word green didn't exist. So the word green started around the time that the U.S. Green Building Council started.
Okay. So that was really 93. When the USGBC started. That's right. I guess Carter administration, energy crisis, get through the 80s, and then green buildings, early 90s, best case, it sounds like. Okay.
That's right. And when I took over at First Community Housing in 2000, I was talking to the chairman of the board of directors, and he offered me the job. And I said, on one condition, we're going to do all green building. And he said, what is green building? So when I started at First Community Housing, the first thing we started doing was to incorporate energy efficiency and non-toxic building materials. We became involved with USGBC. This was before LEED mid-rise. So to do residential buildings with LEED, you had to use LEED commercial,
of course, yeah,
which was not designed for multifamily. So when LEED mid-rise came around and LEED for homes, we just celebrated because all of a sudden we had a LEED category that worked for multifamily housing.
Much more accommodating, yeah. Wow. So, practicing architect for a long period of time, and I've got to ask, because there might be some aspiring architects or engineers or lead consultants listening to the podcast right now, Jeff. Did you have to just go out of your way to put it into projects, these green best practices, or were some clients asking for it? Like, how was that conversation as you were practicing?
As executive director of First Community Housing, I was the client. So we included green features, which is what we called them then, like linoleum or PV panels. But what we found is that when we applied for funding, if we had listed and itemized the green building materials, the city or county that was funding us would delete them from our budget. So we became very good at integrating green into the building in a way that couldn't be taken away by funders or lenders. So it became, after 4 or 5 years of doing this, we became known for doing green building.
Okay.
And at that point, we didn't have to disguise the green building features any longer. They were integrated as they should be.
Okay. Wow. That's sometimes it gets value engineered out, but in your case, they were stripping it out. Well, tell us about that time. So 2000 to 2014, first community housing. What do we need to know about that organization?
Well, the organization was floundering when I took it over. And it's interesting because when I was in private practice and I worked for nonprofit developers, I used to talk to my senior architects and we used to say, we could probably do a better job of building affordable housing. I never thought that I'd be running an affordable housing company. But when it was offered to me, the possibility of being a developer and creating my own rules interested me a great deal because I knew that was the only way that I can incorporate these materials and be in charge of how it was going to happen. So our first efforts were in non-toxic building materials. So we attracted a lot of special needs tenants because they were hyper acutely aware of toxins in the environment. I had a young fellow, probably 30 by now, who was severely autistic. He lived with 2 providers in a 3-bedroom apartment. After 3 months in his apartment, his childhood asthma was gone, and he's off his anti-anxiety meds.
Oh, man, that's amazing.
So these kinds of things just built our reputation, and also we're winning architectural awards. So not only were we doing architectural work that was getting national recognition, but we're also at the time getting LEED Gold.
That's great.
So one of our projects actually got a COTE award, and it was LEED Gold. And there's a big debate amongst the LEED COTE team about whether they should give a COTE award to a project that wasn't platinum.
Oh,
and many people argued that this is an affordable housing project. Yeah. This guy could do it. We also did the first vegetative green roof in San Jose, and I used to get invited to green roof conferences a lot by Paul Kephart at Brenna, who does a lot of green roofs around the world, very famous for that. And he would have me give a presentation, and he would say, listen, if First Community Housing could build affordable housing with a green roof, you guys can do it. So we became a model beyond affordable housing, just to multifamily.
Wow. That's really cool. What a cool story. And congrats on that LEED Gold and the COTE Award. What do we need to know about affordable housing if we're listening in, but maybe we haven't been on projects that seem to be in DC or Portland or maybe the Bay Area or out where you are? There's probably a lot more of them, but is it a multifamily development that only a certain percentage has to be affordable housing? Should it be the whole entire community? What do we need to know about affordable housing? How do you define that?
Well, generally in California, affordable housing is for people who are low income, who earn between 30 to 60% of the area median income. But you can now do affordable housing that goes up to 100% as long as the average of all the incomes is 40%. The interesting thing, a couple of things. One is that the leadership in the United States in multifamily housing that's green or LEED is coming from the nonprofit sector, not from the private sector. Not that there aren't some really good private sector people doing projects, but all the early green building came from the nonprofit affordable housing sector. I think the affordable housing projects need to be 100% affordable because within the 30 to 60% range, there's such a wide range of people. And we used to include at least 20 to 25% of people with developmental disabilities.
Oh, that's great.
And they don't drive. So that brought our parking requirement down and increased our density. And also they thrived on our non-toxic building materials. So we got this formula together, and we actually got called to do affordable projects by council members because they knew that we knew how to work with the community and build really exciting architecture.
And it sounds like you had an A team there as you were doing all that work too. Well, Jeff,
I had a great team, and they still have that same great team at First Community Housing. They're still pumping it out.
Good for you, man. Well, you set that up and turned it around. Let's look back on the highlight reel. It's a humbling question, but what are some of your other proudest achievements? Maybe one of them is a LEED Fellow. It just shows that you really deserve this high honor. But what else is on this highlight reel?
I think one of the things that happened quite by accident is that I became a fellow in the AIA as well. And only about 200 of us, I believe, in the United States that are both AIA and LEED fellows.
It's a big deal.
So that's pretty amazing.
Congrats.
Yeah. So I was excited about that. I think winning the Northern California chapter of USGBC Heroes Award for First Community Housing was probably one of the most outstanding achievements. But some of the achievements are not things you can put on a resume, like having the mayor walk through a building we just finished and saying, "I don't smell anything."
That's a big one, yeah.
There's no toxins. It's like getting into a new car. You smell all the toxins from the plastics.
Right.
You go into a non-toxic building, you don't smell any of that. So
exactly.
Small things like that, or also having an elected official come to an opening of one of our properties and going to a market rate project across the street, which wasn't as nice looking because he assumed that the affordable project would be less good looking than the market rate. So those kind of things, those kind of stories. But basically, it's my tenants. The tenants and their stories, I think, probably more than anything, is what I found satisfactory.
Yeah, no, I can tell you've already given a few examples, and it's just, you've changed their life. That's amazing. Well, thank you for taking us there. So fast forward a little bit more to today, and what's keeping you busy today?
Well, I'm doing a lot of consulting in housing and sustainability, and I teach housing studio at USF School of Architecture. I'm also involved with a firm that's looking into bringing hemp production to the United States to doing non-toxic, non-flammable building materials. So that's just starting. But basically, I'm keeping up mostly on webinars because so much new information is coming out consistently on carbon, on zero electric. And these issues, I find, are not really being paid attention to outside of the circle that we belong to. So when you are a member of USGBC, you go to these conferences with 30,000 people, and you're in a network of people doing great projects, you assume that there's a remarkable amount of these projects happening. But when you get away from that, like I've been now for 5 years, I start seeing that people don't understand global warming or carbon reduction. And when I meet with people, I tell them that really what we need to be looking at now is stop thinking about sustainability and start thinking about carbon reduction. And sustainability is a component of that, but not the other way around. And I think that's the challenge of our times. And there's so much new research coming out that you really have to do, if you're not involved with it on a day-to-day basis, you need to really keep up with the research. So that's what I'm doing quite a bit of.
That's fascinating. Yeah, just several of my podcast guests, Jeff, have said, it's about that shift from operational carbon and efficiency to embodied carbon. But I like where you took us there is sometimes it's difficult to talk about global warming, but maybe it's easier to talk about something more personal like your carbon footprint and where we need to be and a little more on the ground level. But it's fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, when I left First Community Housing 5 years ago, all our buildings were LEED Platinum. And we're starting to investigate getting Living Building Future, which is even further than LEED. And now I realize that that's passé right now because we really need looking at all electric buildings, zero electric, new materials, maybe photovoltaic glass that are going to change things. And just being sustainable is not enough anymore.
And hopefully we can pull the masses because, wow. Yeah, the living building and even beyond that, regenerative design. So
exactly.
It's just fascinating. Well, it's a good segue to one of my favorite questions to ask a professional like you that's made a career out of green buildings. What else should we be reading up on now? What do you think's around the corner in this green building movement?
Well, I think that we need to become more aware of agriculture and soil in talking about regenerative planning. Soil is really important. Reducing carbon is really important in buildings, knowing where products come from and making those compromises in a building, especially affordable housing. We use a lot of vinyl windows because they operate easier for our tenants. Right. But basically, we're using PVC. So a lot of the buildings that you see that are now going to zero carbon or living building challenge are wood windows. And you can't do that in affordable housing. So when we first started working with the Enterprise Foundation, Enterprise Community Foundations, and the living building folks, we tried to make a segue of how affordable housing developers could meet some of these challenges, knowing that they didn't have the budget to go full on. And I think that was a big move. And actually, it was Enterprise Community that really helped us do that.
Good. For those that don't know about Enterprise Green Communities, I've seen some of their work in New Orleans. It sounds like a lot of your projects have done it. But is it important to get that certification, partner with, would you say some projects do Enterprise Communities and LEED, or where does that fit into the mix?
Well, I think it depends on each firm and the size of the firm. And we didn't use Enterprise Communities, even though we were quite close with them, because we wanted to have all our projects be LEED. That way we could say that we've evolved from LEED Gold to LEED Platinum, and we had a standard that all our projects met. Whereas I thought we only had a 12-person firm. So to go then get Enterprise Green or get Wellness or get, something else, it was just too much. Whereas large firms could, especially if they have clients who want that, could get a wellness certificate, could get a LEED certificate, could get net zero. We weren't there at that time. And I think that as a small firm of now probably 15 people, that's a lot to ask because we had no client paying for that. It came out of what little profit we made. So that's why we stayed with LEED, because we wanted to have a trademark that was identifiable.
That's a very identifiable brand for sure. Any other projects you want to, mention that you've had the privilege to work on? Anything come to mind? I'm sure there's been a lot, but what made them unique, or what was the challenge you could share that you overcame?
I think that one of the great projects that I worked on was our 4th Street Studios. That was 100 units of family housing. And the reason why it was really amazing is that we've been working with developmentally disabled people for a long time. And the man who got us started on that, Santee Rogers, was in charge of the local headquarters of the Lanham Act in California, which provides funding for nonprofit groups to do housing for developmentally disabled. And he came to one of our openings. And he had always told us that he didn't want more than 25% of the population to be developmentally disabled. And the reason was he wanted disabled people to integrate with the general population. And he thought that 25% was enough, that they weren't overwhelming the population, but could fit in and people could see them as human. So he came to our opening, and here we have a high-rise, and people very rarely had lived in a high-rise before. Matter of fact, the first 3 months of this building being in operation, we didn't see any kids on the playgrounds because they were running up and down the elevators, playing on the elevators. So we had an opening, and there was Mexican food, a lot of Latinos in our buildings, Blacks, developmentally disabled, white folks, and Santee was sitting next to me, and he was saying, this is what I've always dreamed of, is having developmentally disabled people in a community where they didn't stand out, but they fit in and were accepted. And to me, that was that has nothing to do with architecture. That has to do with where your heart's at, and having non-toxic buildings that were energy efficient. We work with people doing mini fruit trees on their decks so they can have food. The amount of services that are being provided now by nonprofit housing developers are really substantial.
And it goes back to that word community that you mentioned even back at Kent State and those common areas. And it just kind of full circle there. So I can see how that's very a proud accomplishment and different layers of diversity there too. Well, Jeff, let's talk a little more about you. A few rapid fire questions. What would you say is your specialty or gift? What are you best at?
I would say teaching, housing studio, and also putting together integrated design teams that could thrive and do a creative project.
Good. No, I bet you're the cool professor everybody wants in class, right? You got a lot of good stories there too. Well, do you have any good habits, any routines, rituals that help you stay on point?
Well, actually, going to farmers market is what keeps me alive right now during this quarantine, is that, supporting local farmers who come out in this weather. And also it links right to what we were talking about with regenerative architecture, is that local organic farmers and farmers markets and changing the way we produce food and the way we treat soil, I feel really connected to that. So, for instance, the building I'm in, which is a co-housing building, we compost all our food, and we're in an urban environment. So that's really important.
Yeah, it's an unusual blessing in disguise how all the farmers have really been able to support during this time. You're right, and we need to keep it up. That's amazing. I'm a fan of the bucket list. As you get to know me more, what are one or two things maybe on your bucket list?
Let me think. That's interesting.
Yeah, sometimes it's adventure or travel, write a book. Who knows?
Well, I have no desire to write a book, even though people have asked me. I'm not a writer. I like doing PowerPoints and things like that. But I think continuously promoting non-toxic building materials, promoting local organic agriculture, and especially if this new venture happens with the hemp, that all interests me, and it all kind of links together for me.
And where would that be imported from? I mean, is there a place in the world that you think really is nailing it with materials and healthy materials that maybe you want to go visit and learn from when it's okay to travel again?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Not necessarily. I mean, there's places, like Parsons in New York City is one of the major places teaching healthy materials. I talk about it in my classes all the time, but it still hasn't caught on a lot in the profession. Yes. And it is, you do get LEED points for it.
Yeah.
And I think it's been overshadowed recently by the net zero carbon and electricity. But the use of natural materials obviously is a component of that, so that we do have a lot of buildings now made out of wood and bamboo and other kinds of materials that are non-toxic, that just the breathing environment and the importance of ventilation, especially with what's happening in California right now and also with COVID, we have to improve our air circulation systems.
No, you're right. If we lean on a program like LEED that's helped us so much, it's still weighted towards carbon emission reduction, which of course is important. But how do we get a little more credit for the healthy materials and for better air quality? How about books? Is there a book or two you'd recommend to the audience? Doesn't even have to be about green buildings.
The one I recommend to my students is The New Carbon Architecture.
Oh, wow. Okay.
By Bruce King. And even if we're not dealing with sustainability, and of course, I still make this something that students need to look at. I think it's really important. It has a lot of really good information, and it was finished, 2 or 3 years ago, so it's already out of date. So it's only by taking webinars that you find out more until the next book comes out. But things are happening so fast that it's hard to keep up with books.
Yeah, you're a continuous learner. I'll put the link to that book in the podcast show notes so everyone can check it out. It sounds like you do spend a lot of time webinars, learning, reading. Any other kind of best practices on, do you give yourself permission to go somewhere and think, go somewhere and learn? Is there a certain kind of setting there? I think with our busy world we live in, Jeff, it's sometimes we almost need to schedule some time to think and plan or learn. I don't know. How does that work for you?
Well, I try to spend a lot of time alone quietly and just let my mind go where it's going to go.
Yeah.
It tends to always wind up about architecture for some reason.
Man, that high school class, it
goes right back to that, And it is interesting because when I was in high school, just to go back to that, I was not a great student. I had high SATs, and they called me an underachiever. So the high school guidance counselor was not kind to me on my college applications. So we were getting frustrated, and my high school teacher, architecture teacher, I came home one day and I found him talking to my mother in our living room. And he said, you were talking about mentors. He told my mother, do not give up on Jeff because he is going to be a really good architect. Wow. So the story ends with my mother, when I became a fellow in the AIA, calling me and say, do you mind if I contact Harry Kanan, your teacher from high school, and tell him that you just became an AIA fellow? Oh, man. And she called him up and she goes, this is Natalie Oberdorfer. And he goes, Jeff's mom?
Oh, nice.
And that was 40 years after high school. So just to bring around people who have been my mentor, and much more than a mentor, hearing of that success.
Unbelievable. What a story. Literally, there's goosebumps. Well, yeah, I neglected to go there. So why don't we go there? Anyone else that maybe opened a door or had influence on you along the way? I'm sure you've become a mentor to several others. But Jeff, who else would you call?
I would say that my guidance and that's not my guidance counselor, but my advisor in architecture school, John Flynn. When I started going off in different directions and all the architectural faculty was saying you have to decide if you want to be an architect or a sociologist, and I would say, why can't I just be a good architect? He supported me, got me into the Honors College, and took me to Neela Park in Cleveland to show me their lighting labs. And that's when I wrote my thesis on lighting. So he also got me into EDRA, the Environmental Design Research Association. So he was definitely a mentor in college. That he allowed me to do things that most of the other students couldn't even imagine doing, because I was on the fringe about some of these things, which are now considered normal.
It's so funny. You're right. I mean, the programs weren't there yet, but well, you heard it here. I mean, mentors are very important. I mean, some you have access to, some just have influence and you follow their work. Well, Jeff, as we start to come to a little bit of a close here, two questions. One is there anything you wish you'd have known earlier in your career?
I wish that I had taken more landscape architecture courses in landscape and ecology. And I did take one course at Kent State, but I think that as an urban designer, when I was principal architect for the redevelopment agency, I realized that I really needed to have more knowledge of urban ecology and landscape. And that's one thing I would have done looking back. That would have given me a lot wider skill set.
Sure. Well, really good advice there. All right, my last question. Let's say there's someone listening right now thinking of jumping into this green building movement. What words of encouragement do you have for them?
Go for it. Become passionate, do your research, work wherever you can that they let you experiment or learn from them, no matter whether it's a contractor, an architect, whoever it is that's doing green building, learn from them.
Love it. Wow. Literally the storytelling. You're a great storyteller, Jeff. This has been Jeff Oberdorfer, LEED Fellow out in Santa Cruz. Jeff, thank you for your time today on the podcast.
Thank you. Good meeting you.
I just want to say thank you to our loyal listeners. We actually are celebrating over 1 year here on the Green Building Matters podcast. Me and the entire team were stoked and just so glad you continue to listen every Wednesday morning to a new interview with a green building professional here in this industry, or just some pro tips that we want to make sure that you are getting straight from us, straight to you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. At GBES.com, our mission is to advance the green building movement through best-in-class education and encouragement. Remember, you can go to gbes.com/podcast for any notes and links that we mentioned in today's episode. And you can actually see the other episodes that have already been recorded with our amazing guests. Please tell your friends about this podcast. Tell your colleagues. And if you really enjoyed it, leave a positive review on iTunes. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on next week's episode.